Let me now bring on board Mr. Anil Razdan, former Power Secretary, along with him K. Shankar, Associate Director, Institutional Research with Edelweiss Financial Services. Anil, let me kickstart the discussion with you. Now, CERC in the judgment has advocated for a compensation for Adani Power due to issues faced by the company in Indonesia. Do you think this is a step in the right direction?
I think it was a very difficult decision to take because they were charting on hitherto uncharted territory. But I think we had reached a situation where it was virtually impossible for the generators to be able to supply power at the previously contracted rates. It's not a one-time transaction. These are long-term transactions going into several years, 25 years. So I think we had to take a fair view of the situation, an equitable view of the situation, because even if you see these were to convert to NPAs, the financial institutions would not have been able to rejig or restart these operations and produce power, and there would have been continued losses because it's a hard fact that fuel costs went up in another country for factors which are beyond the control of the particular power producer. However, we have to keep in mind that the hit on the consumer is not unduly high, and that the hit is also shared by the power producer. I think the power producers will have to come clean wherever they're owning the mining assets abroad. They'll have to declare what is the profit they're making, the net profit on the hiked coal prices there, if they're owning the coal assets abroad. I would say that their takeaway profits at the end of the whole temporary adjustment should not be probably as high as they would have been in the normal situation, because if the consumer is paying more, then the producer also must take a small hit. Also along with it may be a proportional hit. So I think this is a kind of an equitable arrangement that is sought to have been brought about by CERC, but obviously, as somebody's commented today, it's one of the rarest of rare cases. We don't expect this to be a normal situation, but then the UMPP law, or the law relating to long-term buying of power through a competitive bidding mechanism, is also an evolving law, and it's quite clear that I do not think we can take a 25-year or 10-year call on power prices when fuel is not entirely in your hands. Even domestic prices can keep rising. In the days of yore, there used to be fuel price adjustment. I think the mechanisms for procurement of power will have to tweak in those factors, and I think at this point it is particularly important because the good work done in the 11th plan has brought us to a capability where we are now setting up almost 20 to 22,000, I would say, capability of capacity addition in a year, which was our 5-year achievement. Now this is going to happen for 3-4 years, and if we do not set this right, there's going to be a huge drought suddenly towards the end of the 12th plan and the beginning of the 13th plan.
Right. Fair point, Mr. Razdan. Hold on to that thought. Lots more to chat about with you. But Shankar, just want to get you in on this. Private companies like Tata Power, Reliance Power, JSW Energy have all applied for a similar petition with CERC for tariff revision. Do you see a similar order coming along from the regulator for them as well?
I think so. One of the things is being fairly certain. The way the order has been mentioned and the contours that has been specified and the broad framework that they are mentioning, it makes it very clear that the project has to be affected and it has to be commercially unviable for an unprecedented amount of time, and it has to be only because of external factors and not because of any conscious aggressive bidding of that sort. So I think so. Having said that, it will be a case-to-case thing. It will be unfair to comment at this stage which all projects would come up. But I think so, like Mr. Razdan has also said, it has been a difficult thing, but this was something which we had to do it, and net the outcome will be a win-to-win, a win-win kind of a situation for both parties, especially considering the fact that the power developers are already incurring the fixed capacity charges, but at the same time they are not operating at an optimal level of capacities. Both Adani and Tata Power are not running the plants at the optimal level. If they get this tariff hike, there is an expectation that they will run the optimal level. So the marginal cost of incremental electricity is far cheaper than what you would have otherwise bought from either the open market or the long-term PPAs. So in that perspective, if you see it, it will be still beneficial in that sense.
Mr. Razdan, fair point that CERC has decided to bail out companies which were dependent on Indonesian coal. But when the UMPPs were awarded, several Indian companies also got access to coal blocks and coal mines. Companies like Reliance Power, GSPL. Unfortunately, they also have failed to generate power. What happens to those companies?
I think it's a case-to-case basis where there is no real problem on ground. There are no factors which you could call force majeure or factors which are frustrating the contract or making the contract impossible to perform. Those will have to be considered again, as Shankar said, on a case-to-case basis. We'll have to examine what really has gone wrong with somebody who's been too aggressive in his bidding. He'll have to bide his time a bit. He will not be getting the same degree of compassion from a court or from a regulator, I suspect. It will be a case-to-case study, as Shankar says. I think we'll have to see what are the factors which are holding them back, because the understanding was that all clearances would come in time, there would be no hold-ups, and hopefully the structures would not be disturbed. Well, of course, nobody can bind future governments or policymakers from doing things, but then we've got to see which is the larger public interest. Is it possible to procure power in the longer time frame, in the time frame in which these contracts were envisioned, for any cheaper cost? Is there a better way of doing things? I think one point which the regulator has recently made is to try and see if more merchant power can be sold out and that mix can be made. But it's a good exercise to go through it, but the moment I think the power exchange prices are not too high and the days of quick money in merchant power are over, those 2-3 year windows were there, which some people took as an evergreen possibility, and that won't happen. We'll have to live with reality. We'll have to see if we can get cheaper power. And as I say, if the consumer is taking a hit, the power producer will also have to take a hit, and its profitability should not be as high as was envisaged earlier.
Shankar, coming on a slightly more stock-specific impact for us, we all know that in the near term, Adani Power will benefit. What will happen to Tata Power? What will happen to JSPL?
Once again, I would like to highlight, if you have to look at from an Adani Power perspective, and if you have to only see, assuming that they get a 10 paise hike, I'm not mentioning that that's what they will get, just to give you throw up a kind of a number, and since it pertains to around 2,400 odd megawatts of projects, we believe the earnings would be positive to the extent of around 170 odd crores. But having said that, I'm largely referring to what has been mentioned as of now in the order. Whatever is there in the public domain, these numbers can actually change, and as then when the committee decides. But having said that, we'll have to still wait and see what will be the impact on Tata Power, because the mining profit angle also comes in. And in JSPL, like we have been discussing in this forum so far, it has to be like a case-specific state. Once again, whether kind of an objection, what it is, what is the structure, what they have entered into PPA, so on and so forth, whether the ongoing standard bidding documents allows that. It's open, or in that sense, it's supposed to be seen on a case-to-case basis in that sense. But so, Tata Power is slightly too premature to say, decide on that sense, in terms of impact. But obviously, I would like to believe that, given the fact that the bigger problem for the entire sector is the fuel supplies as of now, this while we understand is a step in the right direction, because yes, most of the developers wanted to know if there is an extraneous factors that impacts the viability of a project, is there a recourse? Yes, in that sense this provides a positive direction, but there are other fundamental and more important and pressing matters like the fuel supplies, like the visibility of cash flows. Those things are also fairly important, and which is where even both companies like Adani Power to some extent is also getting impacted on that sense. It requires greater clarity on that element also.
Mr. Razdan, let me draw your attention to the FSA or the fuel supply agreement. Coal India and NTPC, they both are at loggerheads. They both are owned by Government of India. The nation needs power. Still no FSA in place.
I think it's rather unfortunate because, I mean, going back in time, I'd say that the trigger point was about 90% of the contracted quantities. It's worked at about 85% PLF. I do not know why suddenly Coal India decided to go down to 50%. They should have known that this is the fuel supplies they're promising. They have to be made. People have made large investments. The banks have had a huge exposure. People have contracted that power. Be that as it may, even if they were in a tight spot, I think they should have made all-out efforts to ensure that adequate coal supplies were available. If you can't have a trigger at 90%, tweak it down to 85, 80%. You've got to probably import some coal also and take a hit in your profitability. I mean, this doesn't apply to only coal, to other fuels also. You cannot have a situation where the fuel supplier is raking in profits and the consumer is having to pay more, or without facility of electricity, or the generator is also running into a severe problem, a cash crunch. So I think we've got to look at the entire fuel contracts as good enforceable take-or-pay contracts from the side of the purchaser as well as the producer. That factor has to come in, and I think we've got to take a good hard look at reorganizing the fuel supply sector, particularly coal. There has to be a greater sense of urgency. I do recently see some sense of urgency in trying to increase coal production and liquidation of the stated 50-60 million coal stocks that are lying with the coal companies of Coal India. And another good news is that the last mile connectivity of the rail is coming through the PPP mode. I suspect that there should be a much greater coordination now between coal, power, petroleum and railways, if we've got to handle this in an integrated fashion. And the government is making a move in the right direction. The new RFD exercise that is going through is setting a joint target for all these ministries for achievement of a certain power production target, and trying to rein in everybody. And I think the railways are also showing good signs. But as I say,
Shankar, just closing comments from you as well. What is your thought on the rising concerns of coal shortage and its impact on power production?
Just to give you a sense, and just taking a step ahead from what Mr. Razdan has just said, why it is very important to get 80 to 85% supplies, even if it has got to be of your FSA or the LOA quantity. Because if you have signed a PPA to the extent of 80-85% and you get a correspondingly 80-85% of that, then you net operate at a 7.5% kind of a PLF, and that's the minimum level that you need to operate to service your debt. That means both interest and principal. Now, if you don't operate at those levels, then obviously there is a serious risk on the viability of those projects. That's the reason it becomes very important looking at that. And like Mr. Razdan says, if you are going to supply around 50%, 65% of that quantity, then practically you are running towards kind of an reworking the entire project economics, reworking on the debt, and the systemic impact is far greater than the losses that you are likely to see only on the developer, because the broader economic framework gets impacted much more severely. And that's the reason I said that the fuel impact is far greater while yes, the reworking of a PPA is a step in the right direction, we require much more fast and sooner some kind of a direction of how we are going to address the fuel issues in that sense.
Anil Razdan, K. Shankar, gentlemen, really appreciate your time and thank you for your wonderful insights.